Hi, welcome to Brown Girl Book Lover. I'm Leslie Murray. Today we have Nana Darkoa Sekyiamah, who is a feminist activist, writer, and blogger. She's the co-founder of Adventures for the Bedroom of African Women, an award-winning blog that focuses on African women, sex, and sexualities. And she frequently writes for The Guardian, Open Democracy, and elsewhere. She works with the Association for Women's Rights in Development as a director of communications and tactic. She lives in Accra, Ghana. Boop, 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 boop. I love Accra.
Yes.
Nana, welcome to Brown Girl Book Lover.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yay. I want to talk about your book, The Sex Life of African Women. Why don't you tell us about the concept and how it all came about?
Sure. So I started working on this book in 2015. And in a sense, the inspiration was the work that I've been doing with my best friend, Malika Grant, for a number of years through our blog, Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, which you mentioned, where we've basically been publishing stories about African women's experiences of sex, sexuality, relationships. We've also been sharing our own personal stories on the blog. And part of what I realized over those years is I'm like, oh my goodness, African women, we have so many incredible stories to tell when it comes to sex. And these are stories that I never saw anywhere in the mainstream. And on the contrary, what I saw in mainstream media was very, very narrow, very, very limited, tended to portray African women's sexuality in very negative ways. We're either being portrayed as constantly pregnant or as, beasts of burden. We're pregnant, we're carrying a pot on our head, we are suffering from FGM, or we don't have access to sanitary towels. And even though these are real issues that exist, for me, it was just showing a really, really tiny slice of our experience. And I knew our experience was so much more. And so I thought, okay, why don't I put that together in a book? Why don't I spend time interviewing as many African women from across the continent and diaspora and showcasing that in a book form? And for me, that's always included people from the diaspora, people who are separated from the continent because of slavery, because of colonization, because of migration. And so that also included African-American people.
Why was that so important to bring people from the diaspora, Black women, voices from the diaspora, including women on the continent?
It's because I'm a Pan-Africanist, right? I'm a Pan-Africanist. And for me, that's what's important. The whole of Africa, all our people, wherever they may be in the world, including people in the diaspora.
Just being a Black woman, so much of our sexuality is very private. And so why is it important to bring these ideas in public?
Yeah, I think it's important because for me, it's an extension of the conversation amongst ourselves as Black women and as African women, right? And I also think that even though speaking about something in private can make it a safe space, it's also a way to depoliticize the issue, right? When you're told, oh, that's a private issue, we don't discuss that. It doesn't allow space for you to challenge it or to debate it or to say this is not true, And so for me, sex is really, really political. As feminists, we know this, right? We know that the personal is political. Sex is always described as a personal. And I say it is political. It should be something we should talk about. Growing up on the continent, so many of us don't have access to any education about sex, which means we basically grew up being told sex is bad. If you have sex, you fall pregnant. Nobody says you can have sex just for pleasure. You can use contraceptives such that you don't get pregnant. God forbid, if you got pregnant, there are options. We're never told that. And I think that's also because sex is dealt with as something that's private. And when it becomes public, I think it allows you to have a conversation. It allows you to get rid of myths. It allows you to be informed. It allows you to explore. And I think it gives you a whole lot more space to breathe, basically. And so for me, that's why I want to discuss these issues publicly. And the reality is, on one hand, we're told sex is private. On the other hand, it's not treated like it's private. In my country, Ghana, for example, we have members of parliament currently debating the passing of a frankly homophobic bill. I don't know what else to call it, where they basically want to ban people from being gay. I don't know how it's possible to ban people's sexuality, but the state is discussing it. So it's clearly not a private issue when when they want to legislate who people love, right?
In the book, I found there was a lot of talk about agency and healing, and these things went side by side. Can you tell us more about that? Why this isn't so important for African women in their sexualities to have agency and healing?
Yeah. Let me start with healing. I think one of the things that kind of took me aback when I first started doing the interviews is the number of women who had experienced some sort of child sexual abuse. That for me was like really shocking, you know? Yeah, and that's why we have a section on healing. And I think there was a lot that was going on there. For some women, they had really made huge efforts at healing, and you know, that was also good to see that healing looked different for different people. For some it was, you know, sort of practicing celibacy and taking space and time to figure out what they want outside of what society tells them that you as a woman should expect. For others it was, you know, doing MDMA therapy, for instance. You know, for others it was becoming an activist and speaking up against the violence that women face. And I think that also ties in with the agency, women really just taking control over their own lives, you know, and taking space and time to figure out who they are, what their sexuality is, leave in relationships, even sometimes when those relationships were good, because they realized that their sexuality and that monogamous relationship wasn't compatible. That was the experience of one woman called Estelle, for instance. And yeah, for me, those were really, really strong themes that came across when I was interviewing women. And I'm glad, you know, that like that also comes across when people are reading the book, because it does definitely feel like two sides of the same coin, agency and healing.
Definitely. And I also like the different forms of healing, because I think when we're thinking healing, especially in the West, especially with the commercialization of mindfulness and healing, it's like, oh, you have to do yoga, you know, you have to go to therapy, there are like these prescriptive way of healing. And I love that in this book, there are different ways to heal depending on who you are, what you want, and the trauma that you've endured. When I was reading this book, you know, it reminds me that how trauma really interrupts our lives, especially trauma of child sexual abuse, and how when we haven't processed those things, it stops us from growing and actualizing who we are. And do you think, and do you think by like having these African women talk about their child sexual abuse and talk about the healing and the journey they've gone through, do you think it will like expand our conversation about these issues?
I really hope so. You know, I mean, I think one of the things I've always been interested in doing is just basically facilitating conversations around sex and sexuality. And so I really hope this book and the, you know, stories shared through this book definitely inspires and expands, you know, conversations around trauma, so people can think more about them in more inclusive ways, as well as thinking of how we heal from trauma, you know, in ways that are suited for people, in ways that give people options, in ways that are also community-centered. Yeah.
If you have like a favorite story or from this collection, what one would be?
Can I pick a couple? It's hard for me to pick
go for
one.
it.
But we already spoke about the Alexa story, which I like. I think I liked all the stories of older women, right? Maybe it's because I'm firmly middle-aged right now, so I also need those models. That's also a story by Fatou, who's a woman in her 60s in Senegal, you know, who's like said, like, I've always been a free woman. I've always been a free woman. And she talks about what freedom means to her. And I really love her story. Like, I found it super inspiring. And then there's a woman called Helen Banda, who's originally from Malawi, but lives in the States. And after 10 years of being in a very hetero monogamous relationship, she and her husband decided to open up their relationship. And I also love that story. I love the idea that you can be in a relationship and you can renegotiate the terms of that relationship. And I think not enough people do that, you know, and that I found super inspiring. So I think just like personally, in terms of stories that I resonate with, / kind of like, I wish that was me. Alexis, Fatu, and Helen are the people that I really connected with personally.
Tell me, why is this work so important to you?
For me, it's super important because nothing like this at the moment prior to my book existed, right? Where it's the sexual experiences of African women being dealt with, being spoken about by African women themselves in a nonfiction form, which actually shows us as we are, across our diversities through a range of experiences. That's not trying to it's not trying to be like an anthropological where we're the object of like the white man's gaze, right? It's like us talking amongst ourselves. And I think showing the full complexity of a story, not just one side of it. Many of my personal myths were shattered through the interview process. So for example, I used to think that every person who has experienced FGM, I just was like, if you've experienced FGM, that was it. Your life was over. There's no way you could have pleasure. And, I interviewed Waris, a woman who had experienced FGM, which she very accurately described as child sexual abuse. And again, that's a lens that I had never thought about, right? And she was telling me about an orgasmic experience she had. And in my mind, I was just like, but how? How is that possible? And then she was like, Nana, I remember the clitoris is expansive. And I was like, oh my goodness, I should know this. So, but whenever we hear stories of FGM in the media, it's always the horror stories. And it is a horrible, horrible act, but that also takes away agency from women and not showing them what's possible if they have experienced this practice, that it is possible to still have agency over your body and over your pleasure. And yeah, for me, that's the value of this book. I think it shows a more complex story, a richer story about the experiences of African women when it comes to sex and sexuality.
Yes. And I really enjoyed reading the stories, including your story, the last one in the collection, which was a great way of framing just how we're moving about the world, right? In our how we move about the world in so many different ways and the complexities of that.
Absolutely.
Nana, thank you so much for joining me on Brown Girl Book Lover to discuss this beautiful, I think, vignettes, the sex life of African women. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for such a great conversation. It's been lots of fun.
Thank you.